Special Representative Tomas Niklasson, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So first, let me ask you about your recent speech in Geneva. You said that the situation of women and girls' rights continues to deteriorate. You also mentioned that people suffer killings, arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearance, physical abuse, and torture. And you also say that this is unacceptable. The question is, what do you really mean when you say it's unacceptable, and what the EU is doing about it?
You quoted what I said in Geneva in the Human Rights Council, and let's just put that into context for a second. This was a meeting where Special Rapporteur Richard Bennett, who has been given a mandate to monitor the situation when it comes to human rights in Afghanistan, presented his first report. It's a very solid report. It talks about the rights of girls and women being systematically abused. It talks about the specific other areas that you mentioned. And it's actually a catalogue of human rights abuses. And it is also, at least that's my reading, it points to a situation that is deteriorating. It is not that things were not under control a year ago, and that the Taliban were struggling and now things are improving. Things are in many areas getting much worse. What I mean when I say that, or what does the EU mean when we say that it's unacceptable? We mean that the Taliban, as a de facto government, as an interim government, self-appointed, as they call themselves, have responsibility to respect and to make sure that human rights are respected inside the country. And they do not live up to these expectations. Unacceptable from the point of view of the Afghan people, obviously, because their rights are being abused. Unacceptable from the perspective of the international community, with which the Taliban claim that they want to have normal and better relations. So the first response, if you like, to your question, what do we do about it, is precisely we state what the situation is like. We explain the consequences, meaning that we are not ready to recognize the Taliban as a government. It means also that they stay under sanctions, and it means that the world is not ready to interact with them. Has this produced results in terms of an improvement of the human rights situation? No, it hasn't in most areas. But I think it is an obligation for us to stay principled on this issue. And we also know that trying to isolate them even further, as we did in the 1990s, did not produce results. 20 years of military intervention did also not necessarily created an appetite for more forceful intervention. So for the time being, I think we are at a situation where we are stating the position, we are defending the principles, we are defending the rights, but we also wait for the Taliban to move.
And what if they do not move and they do not deliver on any of your expectations or their own promises?
I think the consequences would first of all be felt inside the country. Obviously, people cannot in the long term continue to live under such a regime. We see signs of armed resistance. We see more and more Afghans coming together inside and outside the country to try to present alternatives, to formulate alternatives in terms of a political order. This is not, it's a year since the Islamic Republic collapsed.
So do you expect a kind of uprising from the people against the Taliban because Taliban are being brutal and not delivering on any of the promises?
I think that's one possibility. Another issue, which is, you may say, not direct. I mean, human rights is not the only thing, of course, what the Taliban are working on or not working on. And if you speak to neighboring countries, security is a primary concern for them. I think it's perhaps the number one concern of neighboring countries. And there the credibility, if they had one, of the Taliban has been severely undermined in the last few months. We saw the US killing of the Al-Qaeda leader Zawahiri in Kabul, hosted by senior Taliban leaders. We have seen ISIS stepping up attacks. We have heard both Pakistan and Iran and other neighboring countries expressing severe concern about the inability of the Taliban to control the situation. So I think the human rights situation is one issue, the security situation is another, the economic situation. The Taliban are, from that point of view, the way I see it, struggling with a number of issues, and it's not the human rights alone that will topple them, but it will add to it.
Yeah, I think from these three problems that you say, human rights, security, and economic crisis that Afghanistan is facing, which one is the worst, you think, for the Taliban and the country?
I think for the Afghan people, for the people of Afghanistan, the economic situation, the humanitarian situation, and the human rights would be the two main factors that may force them to take action, and that will, at the very least, have a very severe impact on their lives. Obviously, Afghans are also killed and they suffer when it comes to the security situation, but I think that the security issue is probably the factor that risks leading to a situation where neighboring countries will take preventive action, will strike against targets, as we have seen. So I think it's a double threat, and I wouldn't really say that one is more important, but I think the security layer has more of international or regional consequences than the other two.
Okay, so you said that people cannot live like this forever, right? And they have expectations from any ruling structure. If the people take action, if you see, for example, uprisings across the country, what's the position of the EU and international community, especially the EU? Will you support such kind of actions against the Taliban, especially from the people's side?
The EU is not actively supporting, the EU is not supporting politically or in a material way military resistance. People have the right to rise up, people have the right to protest, people have the right to have expectations, but we also, or I don't think that the situation is such that armed resistance right now is likely to succeed. The Taliban are still pretty strong. They do, for the first time in a long period of Afghan history, actually control almost all of the country. And I think it's unlikely that military uprising or military resistance will immediately lead to a change. I see a second risk by focusing too much on military resistance, and that is precisely that there's a risk that neighbors will intervene, feel threatened by supporting certain ethnic groups, for example, against others. And then we really see that Afghanistan could become a factor of instability rather than of stability in the region.
Well, let me come back to my first question. And what the EU is doing in Afghanistan. We hear that EU is bringing like millions of dollars to the country to support the country's economy. Can you explain to our viewers how much is that money, and how that money is spent in Afghanistan?
Our primary assistance now is humanitarian assistance, and there we talk about around 300 million euros, which is substantially more than we invested or spent in Afghanistan before the fall of the Islamic Republic. That assistance is distributed as it always has been, not through the government, not through the interim government, not through the Taliban, but working very much with our humanitarian partners, including notably the UN organizations, and who then work through local organizations. It's based on solid needs assessment. Those who need assistance should get it, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of faith or religious sect. regardless of which region they live in. That being said, the assistance is not enough, and that means that also people who need it will not get enough.
My question is, do you deliver like millions of euro every week, or do you have money inside the country?
There is a challenge of getting resources into the country, and the UN have proposed various options, most of which the Taliban have rejected. The UN has also actually flown in substantial money into the country. This is, of course, not a long-term solution, but on the other hand, humanitarian assistance is also not a long-term solution. So we are working and trying to provide. And I mean, it's not that we are distributing cash necessarily. A lot of the resources is actually bringing in food, bringing in medical supplies, bringing in vaccines, etc. The other part of our assistance is we have frozen development assistance. We don't have a government we recognize. We don't have an agreed framework. We don't have an entity that respects international law and its obligations and its agreements with the EU. So there again, we cannot do traditional development assistance, but we do try to provide assistance for basic needs and livelihoods. So that means, for example, supporting entrepreneurs, female entrepreneurs. We have 23,000 Afghans who receive support to develop their businesses. It also goes to health, and to some extent also to the education sector.
When it goes to the health and education sector, which are, of course, very, very important sectors of the society, how you can make sure that it doesn't end up in the hands of the Taliban and they are not using these funds to, support their military arms?
I think the first step is that we do not channel it through the Taliban. It goes again to a large extent through UN organizations that have presence throughout the country, and that means that the money is not channeled through the Taliban. Is there a risk that some of the benefits of a more stable Afghanistan somehow benefits the interim government? Yes, I think that's a risk, and I think that's a dilemma we are facing and other partners are facing. Can you actually stabilize, meaning in concrete terms, can you help people survive without, to some extent, also making the country more stable, which would be, in other words, decrease the threat against the interim government? I don't think we can.
Okay. EU has been an advocate of human rights universally, and yourself, as an individual and as a diplomat, have been an advocate of human rights, at least in Afghanistan. We have seen that. When you see and you meet the Taliban leaders, including Sirajuddin Haqqani, who is one of the #1 terrorists around the world. I mean, his name is in the lists and sanctions, and he is, of course, accused of being a human rights abuser. How do you feel?
I try, when I am in that conversation, to focus on what I want to talk about, the messages I want to convey. I try also to listen to the person I have in front of me, and at that moment not to think too much about history. I also know that some of the Taliban I have been speaking to, including in Doha, have spent more than a decade in Guantanamo, and I still sit in front of them and discuss human rights. And I think that some of them may see me as a Westerner representing some of the things they may have gone through. So I think it may be useful. I think it's necessary, of course, to be aware of, for them and for me, who we have in front of each other, but also try during that specific conversation to focus on the issues and not think too much about dollar signs over another person's head, or what attacks or what plans the person may have carried out.
Yeah, but you also saw that, everyone saw that Zawahiri was in Kabul, and according to the US officials, the Haqqani network was aware of that or giving him the protection there. So don't you think it's important to look and think what the other person is going to do and what are their plans for the future, especially a person like Sirajuddin Haqqani?
I think, I mean, I don't get me wrong. I think it's important, of course, to understand and to be aware. I just mean that I think in the conversation, I focus on the conversation. It doesn't mean that I take the words to mean exactly what the other person wants me to understand.
So you don't trust some of or most of the words said to you in those conversations. Do you mean that?
No, I mean there's no blind trust. There is, I think, we are in many ways very far from even minimal trust on the issues, and we have seen in the conversations we have had that we take girls' education, girls' access to secondary schools, where promises were given. And the important thing is not the promises given to us. The important thing is promises given to the Afghan people, but also promises given to the international community that were broken a few days after firm commitments were made. So yes, there is a lack of trust, and what I mean is it is still important. I don't see any alternative or any better alternative to continue to have the conversation.
The impact of the Zawahiri's killing inside Kabul, how that has impacted the relationship between the EU and the Taliban and the broader international community and the Taliban?
I think I haven't been back to Kabul since the attack. I last met some of the Taliban leaders in Tashkent just a week before that attack. We have seen, and I have heard American colleagues speaking about how it has impacted their relations. We have also seen, as I mentioned previously, neighboring countries expressing more skepticism about the capacity of the Taliban in terms of their CT capacity, their counterinsurgency.
Is it about the capacity of the Taliban, or is it about Taliban being trustworthy because they're still affiliated with their old friends, Al-Qaeda? Which one is the question, the capacity or trustworthiness?
I think it can be both, and I think the answer may, and then sometimes in some cases for specific organizations it may be capacity. I think ISIS may be a case. Al-Qaeda, I think, is largely unwillingness to take action, and indeed it's not just not to take action, it's actually to host, as we have seen. And I think this puts in question let me go back. I think if you look back in March, there was quite strong pressure from some of the neighbors or willingness to move ahead towards recognition. And I think today we are very, very far from that. So I think it has undermined the credibility, at least in this area, of the Taliban. And that, I think, in the medium term is a major risk to them.
So about the recognition, do you see any EU countries willing to recognize the Taliban anytime soon? Do you foresee anything like that?
No.
And what are the conditions, specific conditions for Taliban to be recognized?
Before going to specific conditions, I think a more general condition would be that they are accepted by its people or by the Afghan people, and they are not.
And how do you measure that being accepted by the people in Afghanistan? Do you mean elections or what?
I think there has to be a process. I mean, our preference in Western democracies and in many other places in the world is elections. I think one can be honest or should be honest about the way elections have been run, or some elections have been run in Afghanistan, and not all Afghans think that's the best way. If there is another way that includes non-Pashtuns, that includes women, that includes everybody, and they have a way of expressing themselves, maybe there is an Afghan alternative. But until there is, it is very difficult for us, of course, to see that the Taliban would have the support they claim they have. More specifically, our foreign ministers a year ago set up what they call five benchmarks for our interaction with the Taliban, for our talks with the Taliban. They are not preconditions for talking, because if they had been, we hadn't approached them in the first place. But they basically come down to five. Three of them, most of the neighbors also talk about. It's about security, CT credibility. It's about an inclusive government. It's about human rights. So these are the three I think everybody agrees are important. And we would add to that the humanitarian access, the ability for humanitarian assistance to be delivered without interference, and also for Afghans who need to leave the country, who want to leave the country and have a safe place to go, to be able to go. The other two are, the last two are as important as the others, but they may be more important for the EU than for some of the neighbors.
Do you see any European countries like Norway hosting the Taliban again in their capitals?
I'm not aware of any such plans. I also think, I know that Norway was criticized by some for the invitation of the Taliban back in January. I was also present in that meeting. They can of course speak for themselves, but my understanding of their intentions is that they tried and succeeded in bringing Taliban together with other Afghans. There was the first time, I think, that the Taliban, after takeover, had relatively serious conversations and direct and firm and frank conversations with members of civil society. The Taliban did not follow up on that, and I think the meeting got what got more attention than the meeting and those talks was perhaps the way in which the Taliban were flown out of Kabul in a chartered jet. But I think, again, if the Taliban had followed up on those talks, if they had seen them had listened to the international community, if they had listened to the civil society, if they had decided to continue that type of engagement and dialogue inside Afghanistan, the appetite, the willingness to host them would probably still be there. For the moment, I don't really see it happening in Europe.
Mm-hmm. So we always hear that the girls' education and the girls above grade 6 education is very important, of course, very important for our country. But based on what you said, it's not the only condition. Like if the Taliban allow girls to go to school, many of the Western countries would recognize them, right?
No, it's not the only condition. I mean, first of all, it's not only about human rights. There are the other issues I mentioned, inclusive government, security, safe passage, and humanitarian access. But also, if you look at human rights, girls' access to secondary education is a part of girls' and women's rights. You have all the other rights, the right to, media freedom, for example, which you as a journalist, of course, will understand the importance of. And there we really see the Taliban silencing not only the opposition, whoever they are, but silencing media and actually banning, preventing both Afghans and us abroad and Afghans abroad who try to understand what's happening from having access to solid information. So it's not that, when the Taliban, and I hope that will happen, decide to open secondary schools throughout the country, that they can then say, well, they can say, but they will not be met by, that's great. We may still say we will say that's overdue, and that's a first step.
The Taliban education minister just 2 days ago said that the people in Afghanistan are not willing to send their girls to school. That's not part of, he said, the culture here. Do you agree with him?
I have to ask you as an Afghan, maybe I speak to the wrong Afghans, but the Afghans I speak to are certainly willing to send their girls to school. I think he may be right that there are parts of the country where this has not been a habit, and there may be some reassurances needed. But we also have seen parents, brothers, and not least girls themselves, protesting, crying in many parts of the country because they were not allowed to go to school.
from your conversations with the Taliban, do you think that they feel the pain of the parents and girls and their girls who cannot go to school? Do you think the Taliban Taliban officials are capable of feeling this pain, or you think there is a wall or a barrier between the emotions of the ordinary people and the Taliban?
In listening to some of the Taliban, I think that there are even senior Taliban who understand the importance of education and who actually talk about it and mean it. I think there are Taliban who can feel a certain empathy for the girls and for the parents. I think there are others who see the girls crying and the parents and see it more as a threat, and certainly would not put it as a major issue that they care about, and say, as we have heard, look, we have been fighting for 20 years and it was not to give the chance for girls to go to school. That's not what our fighters were risking their lives for and were killed for, and we have to deliver on our promises.
It's obvious that most of these kind of decisions are made in Kandahar by the Taliban's supreme leader, Haibatullah Akhundzada. Have you met him?
No, I haven't.
Have you tried to meet him?
No, I have not.
You didn't ask?
I haven't asked. It is not that I wouldn't necessarily want to, but we have also understood from people we have spoken to that he is not the most open to receive foreigners. I also understand that diplomats also from Muslim majority countries have made efforts to see him, which have been turned down recently.
Did you ask other Taliban leaders why he's not willing to host foreign visitors?
We haven't discussed that, no.
So if he is the sole decision maker on most of these important issues, why you're not trying to talk to him as the representative of the EU?
I wouldn't be against talking to him. I think, it's often the case in something that resembles diplomacy, I guess, that you don't always go to the highest level, and you would expect, for example, the interim or the acting foreign minister to be able to convey messages and then to get reply from the leadership, and that's so far what we have chosen to do. But as I said, if it turns out at some point that Kandahar is opening up to conversations with the EU, I would certainly be considering to go.
And what would be the top thing on your agenda if you meet him?
Look, I think I would again try to first of all underline the EU's interests in Afghanistan and try to explain what we hope to see. That we want Afghanistan to be livable, we want Afghans to benefit from and the peace that could finally be there. We want Afghans to have a say about their future. We don't want Afghan to be a link between its neighbors, not a threat to its neighbors. And I would then, in that context, explain why the conditions or the benchmarks and why we see human rights, inclusivity and security, in addition to the other two, as key elements, which are not there for us, but which can lead to and are actually necessary for long-term stability and prosperity and development of Afghanistan.
So you have been in touch with various groups from Afghanistan, especially activists, women activists and politicians. Are you in touch with the National Resistance Front led by Ahmad Massoud?
I have spoken to Mr. Massoud, and the message, I was curious, I was eager to understand this was already about 6 months ago, his thinking, his plans, how he analyzed the developments inside Afghanistan. I don't want to go into the details of those conversations, but I passed the same message as I've done on other occasions, that he makes his choices. I respect his choices as an Afghan, but he should not be mistaken. The EU cannot and will not support armed resistance.
But you support political activism and political resistance.
We are ready to speak to alternatives to the Taliban, but we also, my view is that Afghans who want to create, let's call it an opposition or an alternative, it has to come from them. We have seen examples in the past where leaders have been picked, where foreigners have thought that they know who is the right Afghan and who has a bright future and who should get support. At least I don't know that. And I think we are ready to talk to former politicians, future politicians, people who think they are future politicians but who will fail. But we are not the ones who will bring them together and get them organized. That has to come from inside.
And you have also been in touch with the, as you said, former leaders, like, Ustad Sayaf, Qanuni, Ustad Atta, Ismail Khan, and others who created this council in Turkey mostly. Have you been in touch with them as well?
I have not been in touch with them recently. Most of them I haven't met. I have, during my visits to Kabul, met, for example, former President Karzai and Dr. Abdullah, and we have had good conversations. It has also been difficult for them, as you know, to travel, although Dr. Abdullah managed to visit India. And again, I have told them, as I have told the Taliban, it is not that we don't have a preference when it comes to who should run Afghanistan, and B, we certainly do not push for former leaders to come back. But we think it is important to speak to various groups, to various individuals, but we should not be the one convening or bring them together.
Okay, and my last question, Mr. Special Representative. Where do you see Afghanistan in 6 months to a year from now?
I hope that the world will continue to care and focus, not only, of course, but also on Afghanistan. There are a number of other conflicts in the world that rightfully get a lot of attention. And I see it, and that may well be a very modest ambition, as part of my mandate and part of my task also to help at least Europeans and Europe to keep attention to Afghanistan. It has a harsh winter ahead, as winters are, with close to half the population being or likely facing severe food shortage. So again, short-term priority, try to get more assistance into the country. And then, of course, I hope that there will be, I hope that the Taliban will listen to the concerns expressed by neighboring countries when it comes to security. The expressed concerns not only by me and not primarily by me, but a large number of countries in Geneva when it comes to human rights. And also that they will, I don't expect them to call for elections within 6 months, but I hope that they will try to start listening, having a kind of dialogue at various levels with other Afghans. I don't see it as the most likely scenario, but I see it as the best scenario, so at least I want to point it out as a possibility.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.